So in this video, I'm going to reflect on remarks made by the UK commentator Douglas Murray on the Bill Maher show in the United States. Now, I've been, not a close observer, but Douglas Murray has popped up quite a few times in relation to lots of different issues. He's one of the more well-known conservative critics of contemporary international affairs. He's a conservative, but he's a conservative that you may need to take a little bit more seriously than most. He is a well-informed conservative, and he is a conservative that is very familiar with the real sense of conservatism, as in the Edmund Burke, Andrew Jackson type conservatism. He's made some useful and admittedly important criticisms of some aspects of contemporary international affairs. He is a well-known commentator on such outlets as Sky News and some other conservative Murdoch-type outlets. He's a major contributor to The Spectator magazine in the UK. Now, he's spoken out quite staunchly on the issue of Islam, radical Islam, Islamist violence, linking that with the question of immigration. He famously debated Majid Nawaz some years ago alongside Ayaan Hirsi Ali, which was a direct debate on the issue of Islam and whether or not it was a problematic religion, etc. I can't say that I agree with Douglas Murray on many things. He is anti-European Union. He took the side of the Leave campaign in the Brexit debate of 2016. I do find some of his comments bordering on alarmism. The titles of some of his books, The Strange Death of Europe and all of this. He's quite comfortable with the likes of Jordan Peterson, etc. He sort of flirts with the replacement theory concept a little bit. But all of that aside, I generally regard him as one of the more worthwhile commentators, if for no other reason than to test your own assumptions, because he comes from that conservative background. It's always worth, as any thinker should, expose yourself to people who disagree with you. And I find myself more in disagreement with Douglas Murray than not, in terms of the things that he says. Sometimes I agree. I mean, one thing I will say, I applaud his stance on freedom of expression. I would generally align myself with the view that Islamist violence and Islam as a religion are not completely separable, that there are resources within Islamic scripture that do lend themselves to the possibility of violence as an option. Islam is not unique in that, but it would be wrong to say that Islamist violence and the Islamic tradition, the Islamic texts, the major texts such as the Quran and the Hadith, do not in fact have any connection whatsoever to Islamist violence. That's not to say that they're the sole reason for Islamist violence, but it is disingenuous to disconnect them, and kudos to Douglas Murray for highlighting that. And he's something of a lone voice in that, as time has gone on, although that debate now appears to have fizzled out. It's been replaced now by other concerns around gender and things like that. So, in addition to that, he has moved from his previously staunchly atheistic position to a more mellowed, sort of sympathetic direction with regard to faith. He may not be a convert, but he's certainly a lot less hostile to religion than some of the people that he would have travelled with in the past, such as Sam Harris. He's starting to come out, I've noticed, as being somewhat sympathetic to the idea of religion as a necessary element in society, from the point of view of giving people some kind of direction or some kind of sense of belonging or meaning or something like that. He's not gone as far as the likes of Russell Brand, for example, who recently went and had himself baptized in the Thames, having led a rather licentious life for most of his existence. Now suddenly Russell Brand is a pseudo convert to the faith. But the specific comment that I want to highlight here is the remark that he makes at the start of this clip with Bill Maher, and then I'll play that, and then I'll discuss that and ask a few pointed questions about his assertions before going on then to look at the wider issue in which this is contained. This, of course, has to do with Israel's response to the October 7th attack last year and the mounting death toll in Gaza, the almost now at this point unprecedented human rights catastrophe in the Gaza context. And in this small segment, Douglas Murray is making the point that Israel's response is justified for a very particular kind of reason. And because I first encountered Douglas Murray in relation to something much closer to home from my point of view, which was his book on the aftermath of the Bloody Sunday Inquiry into the Bloody Sunday incident in Derry in 1972. Douglas Murray reported on that incident and reported sympathetically from the point of view of the victims of that event, when a number of unarmed demonstrators were shot dead by British paratroopers. And that sort of gave me a sense that there is some integrity here to his conservatism, in that he viewed that act and the cover-up undermined British credibility in Northern Ireland significantly. So I'm going to play this and then I'm going to comment on it.
My view is that and I've seen the conflict up close, and I still believe that, first of all, you can't just put out 80% of a fire. You have to put out the whole thing. You can't destroy 80% of Hamas. You can't not get the leader who masterminded the 7th Sinwar. And that's all in Rafah. And the second thing is, I don't think there's any law of war that says you can start a war, and then when you begin to lose it, you say, let's pretend we didn't start it.
Okay, so just on that comment about 80% of Hamas versus 100% of Hamas. This is in reference to Israel's incursion into Gaza a few weeks after the October 7th attack, where 1,200 Israelis and a number of others were killed by Hamas in a brutal attack. And I've made it clear in other videos, I'm going to nail my colours to the mast very clearly. I have absolutely no time for Hamas. Primarily because Hamas isn't really interested in Palestinian liberation. They are an Islamist cult who want to establish a theocratic regime. And they are using the people of Gaza and the Palestinian cause to further their own theologically driven ambitions. But my point here is that Douglas Murray, unfortunately, has fallen into that trap of, because you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Because will Israel's destruction of Gaza result in the destruction of Hamas? Will Israel's destruction of Hamas end radical militant Islamist resistance in Israel, against Israel? I fear not. I fear that with every bomb attack, with every airstrike, with the creation of more rubble, with the creation of more casualties, more deaths, more dead children, more dead, and let's be clear, siblings, brothers and sisters, parents, and the survivors who look upon that, who wander the rubble of Gaza, and they know what's going on, no matter how young they are. Do they seriously think, does Douglas Murray, do the Israelis seriously think that even with the destruction of 100% of the Hamas terror organization in Gaza, that this will somehow end? And this is my point that brings me back to Douglas Murray's commendable coverage of the Bloody Sunday Inquiry some years ago. He knows better than anyone that when states overreach, they inevitably create more problems than they solve. So, in the Bloody Sunday context, the killing of, let's be honest about it, the murder of 14 unarmed civil rights demonstrators in Derry in Northern Ireland precipitated two things, which Douglas Murray is well aware of. First, it precipitated the destruction of a non-violent protest movement pursuing civil rights. That's the first thing that those killings did. The second and more dangerous thing that they did was that they ignited the radical, militant, extremist wing of nationalism in Northern Ireland, and indeed across the island of Ireland. And they precipitated a dramatic uptick in membership of the Provisional IRA. So the very act of trying to deal with militancy, when states overreach, they created more militants. That conflict went on for another 30 years. 20 years. Near enough 30 years. And that's on a small scale. We're talking about the deployment of a single regiment into a major population centre, the mishandled, bungled breakdown in discipline that happened within the British troops and among British troops on the day that resulted in the deaths of 14 people. The subsequent inquiry, the attempt to cover up what happened, further alienated the population from the British state and convinced many that the British state is not a neutral arbiter of relations between, let's be clear, its own citizens. As someone pointed out to reporters at the time, be very clear what happened here today. British soldiers shot dead British citizens on British streets. Now, translate this now to the Gaza context. Now what's happening? Israel has unleashed a devastating, violent campaign prosecuted by a professional military with significant resources against a large population centre, a densely compacted population centre. The results so far, even accounting for the downgrading of estimates by the United Nations, is that several thousand women and children have already died. And in total, over 30,000 people within the territory have been killed. There is no way that that is not going to radicalize, perpetuate this conflict, as if it already needed radicalization. And we already know, for example, that the Israeli authorities were quite happy to allow Hamas to continue to rule Gaza. It saved them the trouble of distinguishing between Palestinians and Hamas militants when it came to any response from Hamas attacks. The rubble of Gaza is the seedbed of a new and updated Hamas. A Hamas 2.0 will emerge from this. It is now forming in the minds of young people across the Strip and elsewhere. Israel may well destroy this Hamas, but it will not prevent the rise of a new one. Because Gaza's children, Gaza's people, are being radicalized. They will not forget this. And in a sense, Israel doesn't want them to forget. That's why there's been so much destruction. It's not just about rooting out the militants. The real solution to the destruction of an organization like Hamas is a political strategy, not a military one. There is no military defeat for asymmetric actors like Hamas. The IRA were never ultimately defeated. They came to an agreed cessation of violence, which led in turn to a political transformation. There is no military solution to this conflict. So I'm surprised at Douglas Murray not knowing this. This is why I made this. I was struck by this comment. I get where he comes from in relation to radical Islam and its links to terrorism and its, the reservoir of resources within Islamic doctrines. I understand where he comes from. I've read those doctrines too. But he seems to be very blind to the fact that Israel's response here is ultimately not going to solve this problem. It's going to make it worse. And I would go so far as to venture that this response to this issue will accumulate huge security issues for Israel in the future. And they may ultimately, head that off with the construction of more robust border defenses. But there are ways ultimately to attack a country without going through its border. And I fear that in the long term, Israel will find that it has just sown the seeds of serious security problems for itself in the future.
But that is always what Israel faces.
Sure. I mean, it's very strange. A year before I was in Ukraine, I was with the Ukrainian armed forces when they were retaking land from the Russians, and nobody was saying, oh, hold on, don't win too much. Everyone was egging them on. Every Western leader gets a shot of testosterone whenever they talk about the Ukrainian armed forces. And yet the Israelis never allowed to win.
Yeah.
Very strange.
I find the analogy with Ukraine laughable, frankly. We're talking about two major state actors. Hamas is a terrorist organization. But there is already an existing long-standing issue between Israel and the Palestinians. It is not the same. You only have to go back 30 years for Ukraine, which didn't exist as an independent state prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, was incorporated into the Soviet Union. It was part of the Soviet Union. This is not like with like. This is a false comparison.
Why? Is that anti-Semitism, would you say? That why they have a set of rules for them? I mean, they truly are the chosen people. They're chosen to not win the war. I agree.
Yeah, and I mean, for some reason, I think anti-Semitism is one of the reasons. Whenever Israel is involved in a conflict, the whole world goes bananas. And you can't even have a Eurovision Song Contest without it becoming an Israel-Gaza thing. It's crazy. Everyone gets obsessed with this conflict. And I think one reason is, by the way, is because a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans and people of all stripes, have said for a generation, until the Palestinian-Israeli issue is solved, there won't be peace in the Middle East. As if you solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue and then the economy of Yemen starts to boom, and then like the Iranian mullahs give women rights and like the Saudis become really keen on the gays. No.
No, I have to say, I tend to agree with him there. And this is what's somewhat frustrating about listening to Douglas Murray on that issue, because he's perfectly right. And I've read the various Arab Human Development reports and the OIC 10-year plan of action and all the rest of it. I do research on this, and I know exactly what he's saying there. They are all pinning the blame for the entire region's economic and social underdevelopment on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is just ludicrous. They're fixated on this. And most of the Arab world and the wider Islamic world, if you want to use that terminology, they don't really care about the Palestinian people. They only care about them when the Israelis are killing them. And if, anything is to ever come of this, then there's going to have to be a political solution to this. But what struck me here is that despite that, he is correct on that. There are serious issues with those societies in the Middle East, across the Gulf, and across into South Asia that are not, they simply are not bastions of human rights and individual freedom. They're just not. But at the same time, I find Douglas's assertions about Israel's need to destroy Hamas in conventional terms, in other words, the destruction of their infrastructure, the destruction of the organization, I find these incredibly short-sighted. And he really should know better on this. He knows that this is not going to work. And no, Israel will not win this, not because they're not allowed to win by Western commentators, but because they are sowing the seeds for future security problems. And those problems may well be very, very big. They may be very significant. You have an entire generation, and not confined to Gaza, of Palestinians radicalized by Israel's actions. And for me, that marks a fundamental tension in the commentary of Douglas Murray. He's right about some things, but he's so very wrong about other things. And this is just one of those examples.